The Prepared School Psych podcast is dedicated to enhancing your effectiveness as a school psychologist. Today's episode tackles a topic that listeners asked us to explore. When do you decide that evaluation for special education is the next step in the process for a student who is struggling in school? I am pleased to welcome back our guest, Dr. Amy Merenda, a licensed educational psychologist and valued member of the Panzeric Learning Solutions team. You may remember her as my co host from some of our Summer Boot Camp 2024 sessions, as well as a content specialist inside our Prepared School Site community. Amy brings extensive experience in customized educational assessments, independent evaluations, and IEP consultation. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the framework of multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, and how it can be utilized to effectively address the diverse needs of students. I look forward to this conversation, and as always, welcome back, Amy.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be back.
Well, as we all know, I usually ask first-time guests about their favorite TV show, but since this is the third time you've been on the podcast, I wanted to ask a different question. As with everyone in this field, you are a super busy human being. TV is a great escape. What else do you use to bring that work-life harmony to your daily life?
Well, first, I have to say I love the phrase work-life harmony over work-life balance. I loved the word harmony. I really, two main things come to mind. I love to take walks and I like to incorporate other family members. I might walk my baby or walk my dog or convince my husband somehow to go on a walk too. So walks are great. I try to take a walk every day. And I also love audiobooks. If you know me, you know I'm an audiobook fan. And it's kind of like TV in that you can almost escape into thinking about something else, but you can do it while you're doing your laundry or doing another non-preferred task. So I love both of those things too. And they can also keep you maybe more present in the moment sometimes than TV. So sometimes I need that when I'm like, oh, I need to also, you know, be present at home or think about something else. So those are definitely two activities I love that kind of keep me with that harmony in mind. I love that word, harmony.
Well, I know you usually love to talk about one of your apps that you talk about for your audiobooks
Oh,
because
yeah.
so many people pay so much money
Yes.
to access audiobooks. So, do you want to share with
Oh my
everyone your
gosh.
favorite
Absolutely.
app?
Yes, I love Libby, Libby. And it's a free app that you use your library card, at least in California. I'm not sure if it's in other states, but I'm sure there are things like it. And you put your library card information into the app, like the library card number, and then you can rent audiobooks from your library and they just come to your phone. And then when they have to be returned, they just disappear and get returned back into the cloud universe. But that way you're not paying for them. You might have to wait sometimes, like a couple weeks wait, as you would like at the library if the physical book wasn't there. But it'll just populate in your app when it's ready for you. You can also download digital books too, like ones you can read like on your phone or a Kindle or something. So I love Libby. Thank you for letting me put that plug in.
You are welcome. You are welcome. Well, I understand you're not currently working in a school setting this year. However, you recently were. Can you share with us, as a school psychologist, what was it like when it came to implementing MTSS?
I read this question ahead of time and I was like, what phrase can I use that is professional but honest? I'm just going to be very transparent with people because I think even folks I used to work with would agree. Like, I'm not saying something people didn't know, but a lot of times it was a dumpster fire. We had these ideas and we wanted to implement these great strategies. We had reasons behind them. It was really challenging to get other members of this necessary team on board with you, whether that's an administrator, a gen ed teacher, somebody else kind of within that system that you need. And I know we're going to talk more about that today, but it was really hard. And when you were, again, I have to be careful of words. I don't want to say a believer in MTSS because it's not a belief system, because we know there's a lot of research behind it. We know why we do this. It's very important. But I'll say an advocate. When you're an advocate for following an MTSS process, I think you can run into a lot of roadblocks. And that's what I found. And I was at several school sites in my tenure in the public schools. And so it wasn't just one school, this,
Mhm.
and it seemed to be a bigger issue than just the sites that I was at too. And again, we can talk more about that today, but it was very challenging. I think feeling confident in implementing it in a way that you would feel you're doing it with fidelity and you could stand behind was also really hard to do.
I'm curious, when you think about the implementation, were you part of that for your schools from the get-go?
Yes, yes. And when I started in the schools 7 years ago, I want to say, we were like the district I was working in was really working on having our different tier 1 teams and our tier 2 teams, and we were not quite yet the place to have a tier 3 team. We were building up there in the district, but school psychologists were expected to be an active member of the tier 2 teams.
Okay.
You could be on the tier 1 team with all of the spare time that we have. So most people weren't, just because we couldn't fit it in. But tier 2, yes, school psychologists were expected to participate, and so we really were in those conversations, doing trainings for our school sites, talking about the importance. We were definitely on the front lines.
Okay. I was just curious for those listening, because I know some people are coming in to a system, whatever it looks like, that's already in place and maybe
Yeah,
trying to figure out what is going on or how to make some improvements, whereas other people are walking in and they find nothing.
and no
And
no
they're
center.
trying to implement it either at their own school site or similar to kind of your situation. It was a district wide initiative, but
Yes.
each individual school site was figuring that out, what that was going to look like for them.
Definitely. And, the district that I worked in was very big. So even though it was a district wide type of initiative, going from site to site, I mean, we know how it is. It's different worlds, right? Sometimes one school is one culture and system and community. And yes, we might all fall under this overarching, this is what MTSS is, but there were absolute differences at school sites. And so for those of the listeners that maybe are in that second boat where like they're coming in with really nothing in place,
Yeah.
I hope that this conversation can help give some ideas to, hey, maybe I could try that little thing, right? And just start something or start this conversation that could come from this. So there's a lot to this system, and I can't wait to kind of dive into some of it with you.
I love this conversation that we're having. I'm so excited that we're having this conversation. I know for myself, being part of the field for a little bit longer than you, when we first started talking about this at my schools, we called it RTI, and
Yeah.
now we would call it MTSS. But I remember from my standpoint, it was a school by school situation for me, where it was me trying to bring something in to the schools that I was assigned to and figure out what this might look like there.
Mhm.
And like you had said, one school, it looked very different than the next school,
Yeah.
not just because of all the different personalities that were involved there, but also a wide range of needs were
Yes,
very different from school A to school B. And
definitely.
so well, speaking of that, how did you collaborate with the other school staff members, like teachers and admin? Because we all want effective MTSS implementation. So, what did that look like for you in your role?
So every year, my school sites would ask me to do some kind of pre service presentation for the staff. So we would do stuff like that. I found that it was more effective to do like bite sized conversations through different staff meetings. Again, we're not available as school psychs to go to every staff meeting for every school. Like, that's just not feasible often in our schedule. So, we tried it both ways at my site. Like, there were years where I just had the conversation with staff in the beginning of the year to talk about, hey, reminder, look at your tier triangle, with tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Here's what we have going on at our school. Here's why your information is important. I often found that in July or August, when you have that conversation, you might have some excited folks to jump in there, but that fizzles out as the year begins, right? Teachers are overworked and tired. And so, kind of reminding them along the way about the process, I started doing that as I got closer to currently. So, within the last couple of years. And that seemed to be a little bit more effective because teachers were able to ask questions along the way. hey, it's December and I'm exhausted and I can't get support for this situation or this one in class. What should I do? And that became a much more useful discussion than in August when you're like, yay, everyone's rested. Here's what we're going to do. Because we know the energy is different, right?
Yeah.
We also would have bi-monthly meetings where the school psychologist, the administrator, oftentimes our mental health provider, whether it's a counselor, social worker, or a mental health therapist. And we tried to invite, I advocated for anyway, our RSP teachers or special ed teachers when they were available, if that was the case, just to kind of give some ideas about academic interventions.
Mhm.
And what we would do is we'd have these discussions where we would kind of review, we would have MTSS referrals from our school site. Teachers would say, hey, I'm waving the white flag, like I need help here. Our little group would review that referral, come up with some ideas, send those ideas back to the teacher. Oh, we also had a behaviorist at our meetings as
Okay.
well. Now, in our district, our behaviorist would double serve as they were called a PBIS coach, which was wonderful because they were very trained in MTSS and all. You might be hearing this and like, well, that's a luxury. All those
Yes.
different types of people, right? So I think the takeaway here is that we're just reflecting often on the
Mhm.
process and what's available, and often looking around saying who's calling out for help, right? Where are the referrals coming from? You don't have to have all those people at the table. I think the thinking behind that is that you have people with different areas of expertise so they
Mhm.
could have different ideas about things. But again, if you're just getting this going, this might be a check-in once a month with your principal to say, hey, who's been requesting support? How can we help them? Maybe it's us, it's that for you. It just depends. But we had that kind of more established process. And so that's who was a part of our teams. If you notice, though, there is no gen ed representative at those meetings.
Mm.
Our gen ed teacher, they're all teaching. And so they're all busy. But that was a challenge, I have to say. We are experts in our areas offering ideas to these teachers. And sometimes the feedback would be, I don't have time to try that. Or
Mm.
what does that intervention really look like? You guys are giving me these ideas, but I'm busy all day, right? I'm
Yeah.
painting, I'm tired. And so really taking the time to build what that looks like, whether
Mhm.
it's you're going into the classroom, modeling it for the teacher, checking back in with the teacher after you give them this idea that this hive mind has come up with, right?
Yeah.
Just making sure there's that cohesiveness. And I think that the cohesiveness is a trend. It's going to be a trend in our conversation today because one player cannot drive MTSS, right? It takes the whole campus and school and all the adults to work together. So just keep that in mind, especially if you're in the position to kind of create something, right? How can you get input thoughts, check in with people that think differently than you to kind of get that buy in too?
Well, that makes me think of, again, reflecting on some of the multiple schools that I was at.
Yeah.
I had one administrator who was like, let's do this. Like, let's work together. No problem. And then I took that and I went and talked to my other principal who was like, yeah, I don't think we need this. And I was just like, okay, like, I'll come back later. Like,
Yeah.
how do I want to use my time and my energy? I'm going to go back to someone who's like, let's figure out how to do this. And then, collect more data about the impact of that to be
Yeah.
able to take it to others. I do have a clarifying question just because
Yeah.
it's one of the words that is so
Oh, please.
confusing to my brain. You
Yes.
said that you had bi-monthly meetings. Does
Twice a
that
month.
mean twice a month or
Yes.
every other
Yes.
month? Why do we
Twice a
have
month.
words that have two
I
very
don't
different
know.
meanings?
And when people say biweekly, I think the same thing. I'm like, is this 2 times a week or every other week? No, it's 2 times a month. That's
Two
how,
times a month. Okay.
to be clear, that's how our schools chose to do it. There were some schools with higher need, so they met weekly. You know,
Okay.
there were some schools that were a lot tinier than my schools, and maybe they met once a month. It was
Mhm.
really up to that team and what they felt was an effective use of their time, too. Because we also all know when you're in the schools and you get your colleagues around, sometimes half of the meeting is, oh, what are you guys doing next week? Oh, it's Thanksgiving break. And before you know it, your time is maybe not being used
Yeah.
super effectively. So thinking about what's going to get the job done, what's required, right? So for us, it was 2 times a month.
Okay.
That could be it, not that that was a hard and fast rule.
I will just say anytime I see biweekly or bimonthly, I'm
Oh,
always like, what does that
what?
mean for you?
Yes.
You will never see that from me ever because I
'Cause
am
it's
so
not clear.
confused.
Yes, I know.
No. All right. Well, what specific skills or knowledge did you find most helpful as a school psychologist working within your schools, within the district initiative? Who's using this MTSS framework?
I also think this is such a good question because my immediate reaction is to say, oh my gosh, school psychologists, we're trained in all the things. Like we are just great positions to be able to share behavior information and academic and mental health. And those are all very important. I'm not taking away from the importance of that. I think, though, the most effective skill is being able to collaborate with others
Mm,
above all else. Like you could have the best idea and share it. But if it's not shared in a way that is being heard or timed well or communicated well, it's going to go nowhere. And so, really, with it, something like this, like MTSS, where we're expecting people on the ground to just buy in magically to this big systematic change, to me, the most effective skill we can have is how can we blend it all together? How do we communicate? How do we make people not feel stepped on? I always was in an interesting position because I know some psychs have the experience of being a teacher. I was not one of those psychs. I was never a teacher. And I would often say that out loud to teachers like, this is my idea, but I was never a teacher. So this could be awful. Like, tell me what you think and how can we make it better? Just humanizing it a little bit, not to
mhm.
come off like, hey, I'm the school psychologist and I'm trained in all these things, which we are, absolutely. But that's maybe not the message you want to share with your teacher.
Right.
It's not, I have all the answers, like, here I am. It's, hey, I have this idea. What do you think about it? Because your
Mhm.
time, your expertise is valuable too. So, really, it's that effective communication. How can you keep it cohesive? How can you really build that system? Because this is, I mean, MTSS is a system in the
Yeah.
acronym. We're talking about it. So how do you create? I think that really is the most important skill in all of it.
I will say one perspective that I found to be helpful. Again, knowing that, when I was working through this, it was not a district wide initiative yet. And so I felt like it with me sometimes like, hey, I found asking questions from a place of curiosity
Yes.
rather than what I really wanted to do was walk in and complain. Like, why are we not doing this? What is going on here? Like, I think a lot of us, of course, have a sense of frustration about what's not going on.
Oh yeah.
And so, I would go vent to my school psych buddies about that. And then I would walk into a conversation with a question, even something as simple as, hey, all of our kids who are struggling, they walk on down to room 12. That's our intervention teacher. What are they doing in room 12?
Mhm.
And I'll never forget that moment with my principal. She was like, I don't know. Let's go look. And, we figured out that that teacher didn't have evidence based intervention programs going on there.
Sure.
So then it was followed with me offering a little bit of help. I never wanted to be in charge of the whole thing
I know.
because, like you, like everyone who's a school psychologist, we have so many responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so it was always to me like, ask a question. How can I offer a little bit of help and support? And I remember thinking and asking my principal, is it okay? Like, I've gone to a lot of trainings around reading interventions. Is it okay if I do a little bit more research and kind of see some that might be helpful for our school and, within our budget and all those things? Like most principals, what are they? No, no, thank you. Please don't do any research. Yeah. She was like, yeah, let's look
Oh
at that.
yeah.
Let's look at some options here.
Totally.
So, that kind of collaboration, like you said, like what's that kind of timing? How are we bringing up things?
Yes.
Because again, sometimes, and I'm not saying I never walked in and didn't complain to my administrator.
Oh yeah.
We had those moments too. But really trying to figure that out. And again, thinking about people who are walking into a system that either doesn't exist or isn't working 100% great. Like,
Yes.
when do we start asking some of these questions? When do we start offering a little bit of help for places that don't see it as an issue? Can be frustrating.
And who do you ask those questions to, right? You know, Jenny, I cannot imagine you walking into that classroom, seeing a teacher using something that's not evidence based, and then saying, "Excuse me, why are you not using something evidence based?" Right? That's not the person you ask the question to. I think as long as we remember that just like we are playing our part in this system, so is everyone else, right?
Yeah.
That intervention teacher, and I'm just using them as an example for the conversation, but I want to assume that they are also doing the best that they know how to do, that they've been told how to do, that they're informed how to do. So remembering that too, especially when I think about those behavior concerns too, because we hear from our gen ed teachers that they're frustrated and tired, and remembering they're doing their best with the knowledge and the capacity that they have too. And I say this with the absolute knowledge that it's really hard sometimes to keep that mindset, right? Because
Hmm.
you're also tired and overworked. And to be honest, with all of the school psychs listening, we know that on the flip side of a weak MTSS system are all these inappropriate special education referrals.
Right.
So how do you balance that? You know, and I think that's where our conversation from what I remember from the questions is kind of going to go like to the
Yeah.
referral side, but we carry our own frustrations, but just
Mhm.
remembering we all have a role to play. And so does that person that thinks they're doing it good, even if I know that they're maybe not. So how do we influence the system to make that change? Maybe not that particular person.
Yeah. I love the word that you use there, influence,
Yeah,
because so many of us aren't the decision makers, but we can influence the decision
absolutely.
makers. Yeah. Well, which assessment tools or strategies do you find particularly useful for screening or progress monitoring with an MTSS?
Also a great question. So my school, they used, of course, their school-wide, type of benchmark assessments. A lot of schools use things like iReady, stuff like that, where you can kind of gather that. I have to be really honest with our listeners to say that my first few years of being a school psych, I didn't even think to look at some of that because you're just trying to figure out like, what is my job in this whole thing? What do I do? Use all the information you have available to you. State testing, those benchmark assessments, ask teachers questions about grade level assessment, ask them, learn about the things that are already being used. That would kind of be my thought. So I found really any information available to me to be helpful. Now, with the consideration that you need to know what the intention of the tool is, right?
Mm,
Before you just decide that it's helpful or not. But remembering that as you go in. So, any type of benchmark data I found to be really helpful when our students were enrolled in some kind of intervention, whether it was academic intervention, our mental health, groups, or check in, check out, something more behavioral. I have to also be honest and say that we were not always great at doing progress monitoring. It would
mhm.
be we got the student in there and super, now they're in there. But you want to know if it's working. And so I
Yeah.
think our academic intervention teachers are just phenomenal, usually at constantly collecting data. So check in with that person. Maybe create a system where you can have access to some of their progress monitoring data. A lot of times our academic intervention folks are naturally inclined to already be collecting some of this. Mental health and behavior, maybe not so much, because that's a lot of times not a huge focus. Again, it's, hey, this kid having this issue, is the issue better? And, if it's better, then we're doing great. But maybe it's if you're using a particular curriculum, do they have pre and post information? For check in, check out, how are you collecting any check in, check out points or information? Are you saving that? A lot of times teachers work so hard to have these beautiful check in, check out cards. They're like so awesome. Then they erase it at the end of the day and it's gone forever. And the kid got to
Yeah.
see it and that's cool, but I don't get to see it or our team doesn't get to see it. So do you have ways and ideas to collect that? I tried to teach my school about using QR codes and scan, on their phone and just I had a quick little form for the teachers to use. It could even be super basic. Hey, for this kid on check in, check out, how many points did they get today? That's it. It might not be all the info I want, but it might be something. And that's what
Yeah.
something. And it needs to be quick and easy for the teacher. So there's a lot of wiggle room with that. But I think as long as you are making an effort to collect something and then look at it at the end is really what matters. I know I kind of digressed a little from the question, but I think there's a lot there that we sometimes don't always explore, but we should.
Yeah, I think about too having that flexibility in the thinking
Yes.
around sometimes we have people in particular who are like, well, this is the data. In the back of your head, you're like, this isn't the data I need,
Yeah.
but we'll go with it for right now. And again, that timing of like, maybe this isn't the best time to bring this up because I already asked you to do 5 other things differently.
Yes.
And trying to figure out what is the best time or when is the best time to do some of these pieces. I
Absolutely.
I remember teaching my academic intervention teachers how to use Dibbles. I had gone to a
Yeah.
training, I had asked permit, "Is it okay if I talk to them about this thing called Dibbles?" And, like,
Mhm.
my intervention teachers were like, "This sounds great." And so we did that. And I remember at the beginning of the next school year, they had actually asked, they said, the intervention program that we are using also has data. I don't
Okay.
think we also need Dibbles. And I said, okay, even though in the back of my head, I was like, okay, I know the curriculum you're using. I know what you're saying. There is data, but it was a mastery test. It wasn't the same exact thing as a progress monitoring tool.
Sure.
And so I said, fine. And
Yeah.
then honestly, about 2, 3 months later, they came back to me and they're like, we'd like to start it back up again
Yes.
because they saw what they were missing. They
Totally.
were missing some of that data too. It helped them. It wasn't just for me
Mhm.
and the work that I was doing with my data teams. It was something that was useful for them as well to
Yeah.
understand how the students were monitoring progress. And I think in reflection, if I had been like, no, we're all using this, I think we would have been having this unnecessary frustration with one another,
Yeah.
where instead they came around and then they were excited about using it again.
Oh, sure. Jenny, do you know, is Ames Web still around? I remember
I
learning.
believe it is.
Yeah,
Yes.
I
I
think
will
so.
say I I remember before Ames Web and we used to collect data on pieces of paper and I put it in an Excel program. So we're for school districts, sometimes when they say, like, we don't have the money to, you know, get into something like Ames Web or something like that, I'm always like, we can go old fashioned. We can
Absolutely.
collect,
Yeah.
there's so many ways to collect data.
Yes.
And it wasn't so difficult. We didn't have 1,000 kids in intervention for
Mhm.
me to be, entering in their scores on a regular basis. It was not anything that was beyond, my time frame.
Yes. Yeah. I remember we learned about Ames Web in grad school, and then I never heard about it again. So I'm over here like, I don't want to say that if it's not a thing anymore, but I guess it's, but I remember Dibbles was so accessible because you don't have to pay for a lot of things,
Yes.
with Dibbles. So that was helpful for schools. And I think for those of you listening, it's nice to know that there are progress monitoring tools that exist that maybe already exist at your school, number one. Two, that could be free that you could implement, like Dibbles,
Mhm.
or other ones that maybe folks want to explore that maybe would be more costly, like AimsWeb, but you have options.
Yeah.
Just be open, as Jenny said, flexible with your thinking about what that could look like for sure.
Well, one question that you and I get often from our psychologists inside the prepared school site community is how to know if assessment for special education is an appropriate next step for a student.
Yeah, good question.
So for me, it was data was helpful. As a school psych, I love some good data. So how were you using data to identify students who may benefit from additional support or that next step? Let's look at evaluation within your MTSS framework.
Sure. So we would want to first understand what would the potential referral question be, right? And then look at data connected to that. So if the parent or the teacher are concerned about reading, let's look at reading data, right? Just make sure you're kind of on target there so you have some justification. And then what you would want to do is let's say reading is the concern. I know it's a big concern for a lot of folks. So just for the example, we would want to look back. Hey, what was the benchmark for trimester one? Where was this student at? Where are they at now? Are they already participating in an intervention type program? If so, I want to look at the progress monitoring data for that. I always tried to tell my teams, you've got to give it a chance to work, right? If they've been in intervention for 1 week, I would not feel comfortable comparing 1 week to 1 week, right? You would want to make sure we've got 6, 8, 10 weeks of data. We know from our knowledge as school psychologists that that's kind of that magic time of if you're going to see a change after a couple months, you likely would see a change. And then you would want to talk about how big is the change? If there's any change at all, maybe it's staying the same. Okay, that's a little concerning, right? We want to make sure that the student is growing. If they're growing, how much are they growing? That's another concern I hear from teachers is, well, they're making progress, but it's really slow. And so how can you reframe that to, well, we need to, first of all, acknowledge that progress is being made, right?
Yeah.
So it is being made. Maybe to the school psychologist, 1 point of growth after 8 weeks is very slow. Maybe even to us, we're like, okay, that is a lot slower than I would anticipate. But keep in mind, if students are starting off a school year behind, they're
Mhm.
also still going to likely be behind 8 weeks later, right?
Right.
You want to kind of remove this idea that once you're in intervention, or for that case, once you're in special education, everything magically is just going to be fixed and you're going to be up to grade level and it's just not necessarily, right? So having
Yeah.
that understanding of that and just kind of pulling away the veil at that a little bit. So it's all about comparing previous data to current, make sure a significant and appropriate amount of time has gone past. And do you have confidence that whatever's been happening in that time has been done with fidelity?
Mhm.
Done correct. It's being done to the best of that person's ability. No, not every day is perfect. No person is perfect. No student is perfect, but just generally speaking, are the rules being followed? Is it happening consistently? Is it happening as often as it needs to? Things like that. If you're not seeing that growth, then yeah, I would consider an assessment in that area. If you are seeing growth, you could push back, I think, as a team. Now, I say that cautiously, knowing that there are some circumstances you might not push back. But I think from a data perspective, just for the sake of the question, I think you could at that time.
I think one of the other things I would add to that conversation about the data is also, do we have data about the other students that are also in the same intervention group?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
sometimes I find that my students' progress all by itself, like if I don't have the comparison and all I'm doing is comparing it to the student themselves
Yes.
versus, I mean, I think about one student in specifically where everyone else in the group was making progress that was what we expected based on like the manual from the program tells us like this many weeks, this is the type of progress we would see. And most of the students in that program were making that type of progress. The
Yes.
student I was looking at was not.
Yeah.
And, we made sure, is this the right program? Is this the right group? Is there something else going on?
Yes.
And when we've ruled out all those different pieces, I was like, this is the kid I want to evaluate
Yes.
because I can't figure out why this student is not making the typical progress that most of our students in this intervention program are.
Great point.
Well, for many school psychologists, parent requests for evaluation are treated a bit differently than a student that is being discussed by staff and teachers within the MTSS framework. As we know, the Office of Special Ed Programs, or OSEP, shared a memo many years ago that stated we are unable to deny an assessment request just because a student has not gone through all the tiers of MTSS yet. What have been some of your considerations when discussing a parent request for an evaluation?
This is a big question. And for those of you that are just listening, I just want you to know when Jenny started this question, I had big eyes. This happens a lot. This does happen. And I think it can make, I don't want to speak for all school psychologists, but speaking for myself, it can feel frustrating when this can happen because you're like, oh, like I feel stuck, right? I now have an obligation to assess. And you have to remember kind of the child find rule that the threshold to assess is very low. all of those things that you hear your attorney say in your head, and then you're out there doing the job and you're like, oh, I already have 10 open evaluations or whatever it could be. Some things to think about though. Honestly, when this happened at my school, we immediately would hold an SST with the parent to either draft the assessment plan or talk to them about the process. The intention is not to convince the parent not to assess. That's not the goal. The goal is to be honest with you all, I use that as an opportunity to actually learn about what's the concern from this parent so I can do an appropriate assessment. There were times though when we would be open in that discussion and say, you know what, your kid's been in kindergarten for a month. Let's talk about what we can look at and what I have enough information about. And then there were times where parents just were like, oh my gosh, well, let's wait on this. Like I'd like to wait on this or not. Now, sometimes that didn't happen, but I do think there's an incentive not just to get out or in of an assessment. I don't want to come off like that, but to collect valid information and to not waste the kid's time. Sometimes that's what I would say is, I'm going to take this kid out of class. I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to conduct this assessment. Please know that at the end of this, here are potential outcomes, right? And here are some things that could hinder this process. And I just want to tell you that now. So when we get to the end, you've heard some of this information before. We're not determining, we're not saying that's going to happen, but we're saying, hey, here are some things in my school psychologist's mind as I'm jumping into this assessment. When I did stuff like that, when I was just honest, I felt like even when parents did really want that assessment, and of course we did follow through and do that, the end conversations were not negative. They were not tense. They were open because parents could trust that we were giving them accurate information with understanding kind of the parameters that we're working in. So I would just encourage folks to be honest. Also, don't be discouraged, right? I know it can feel like a lot sometimes, and sometimes it feels like there's like a almost like a cold going around where all of a sudden all these groups of parents write all these letters and you're like, oh my gosh, like who's telling people to write letters? And sometimes it feels like that. But also remember that there's a reason that someone is concerned. And so just kind of keep that human centered hat on, someone's worried about something. And how can we as a school team support that parent in figuring it out? If assessment's not the answer, what could be? How can we support? So just try to balance that between, oh, I'm so busy and how do I help this family?
Yeah. I will say too, because I know so many more schools nowadays are just moving forward with all parent requests,
Mhm.
which was a little bit different than 25 years ago. And one of the things I will say is if you have a student who's the parent is bringing up a concern about reading, maybe this child has not been on the radar of anybody. If there is a reading intervention program that has not yet been tried, let's try it during the evaluation
Yes.
timeline
Yes.
and collect that data because even though we're doing an evaluation, part of the evaluation process is to determine does the student actually require special education or could their needs be met within general education? And if the student hasn't been part of our process, we likely don't have as much data about this particular student. So I always say if we have that opportunity, use your timeline wisely to collect some of that data. If it's not an academic concern, it's a behavioral concern. See if we could, start a behavior plan or do a check in, check out and collect some data. Because wouldn't it be great if during that timeline, not only are we learning a lot about the kiddo, but we're figuring out actually check in, check out kind of solves the problem that we were all
Absolutely.
here to address.
And these conversations are hard. I don't want to diminish the fact that we have a really challenging job to talk to families about this important information. But also remember a lot of times when these concerns come up, it's because people want help. And people don't always know what help means or looks like. And just because someone's requesting an assessment doesn't mean they really, really, really want special education. They might not know what that means at your school. So just take that. Maybe, yeah, check in, check out was the answer. And you can come to that meeting with your beautiful psych report and explain that. And that doesn't have to be bad, right? So just kind of keep that mindset of we're here to solve something and to improve something. How can we do that? Through this process. But I love that, Jenny, that those 60 days are very helpful for collecting
Yeah.
that information.
And depending on what state, 50 days or 30 days.
Yeah,
Lots of
very
different
correct, very
timelines.
correct.
Lots
My
of different.
California hat's on.
I know, I know. Well, how has your perspective on the role of school psychologist evolved since you first started working in the school setting?
I think we are absolutely collaborators more than we're led to believe. And I know I was telling you that this was going to be a trend in my answers was being cohesive because it really does matter so much. Even outside of the MTSS process, being a collaborator with a family in the assessment process, with that teacher that needs help in the assessment process. If you're doing counseling, collaborating with all parties involved, we are absolutely collaborators. Sometimes I hear folks call school psychologists gatekeepers, and I don't always love that phrase. I would rather see it as a collaborator. We are there to share knowledge, to teach others about the system itself, how to navigate it, and how to best support the student within the school district parameters, legal parameters, things along those lines. But I think we're absolutely much more integral in the school culture than you might think when you come out of grad school.
Well, can you describe some effective interventions that you and your school teams have used within the MTSS tiers
Yeah.
to address various student needs?
Definitely. So, in our school district, we did have access. Well, at one of my particular schools, we had access to more reading intervention programs, math intervention programs. In terms of mental health, we used structured curriculum like Second Step. Zones of regulation was a fan favorite. And in terms of behavior, we were a fan of check in, check out. I've used it a lot in this conversation, but it can be tailored to different students. It can be personalized. It's a good place to start because you can collect a lot of data. So those were kind of our go-tos. Now, things were, of course, tailored to specific student needs. Maybe a specific behavior plan was written, or maybe the academic intervention was, tailored to that particular student in terms of how often or what it looked like. But just make sure that you have kind of that, here's what we have available. Now, how do we make it work for that student? So those were kind of our favorites at our school.
Well, what were some of the common challenges you've encountered in implementing MTSS?
So I know I kind of said this in my first answer and I go back to it. It's again that creating that collaborative environment, making sure all folks feel heard and understand the why. I think
Mhm.
that's a big part of this is not trying to convince teachers to do everything you're saying without explaining why you're thinking this and what the value is. So explain the why, think about the why, talk about the why with your school team to really build that collaborative environment. That was my biggest hurdle at every school.
So, what strategies or best practices have you found to be ineffective in overcoming a lot of the challenges?
Again, I go back to, this is not, there's no book. Well, actually, there's probably a book about this, Jenny. We're probably going to find it after this, but talk to people, connect with them, make that teacher feel heard, make that administrator feel heard. You might walk out of your principal's office and want to bang your head into the wall because they're not listening to you. But then you're going to go back and you're going to validate them and talk to them and help them understand. I think if we have that approach of like, how do I connect with this person professionally, make them feel valued, make them feel heard, you're going to get a lot farther than not doing that, than making someone feel like you think you have the better answer, which you probably do, but you don't want them to think that, right? You want them to feel valued, just like you want to feel valued when you're sharing that information. So, again, I don't have an article to cite to say value people, but value people, take that time to do that because it's going to build that collaborative bridge so much easier than not.
Well, and if I'm remembering back to one of my first summer boot camps that I was able to provide, we talked a lot about interventions during that time. And I think the two main themes are exactly what we've been hitting on today. One of them was data, which we've talked a lot about, and
Mhm.
the other one was relationships. It was the
Yeah.
relationships.
Yes.
Like when we thought about the fact that for most of us, once again, we are not decision makers, but we have the ability to influence other people over and over again in my conversations during that summer boot camp, we were talking about building those relationships with the decision makers and bringing forth the data. Just
Oh, yeah.
coming in going, we need a reading intervention program versus, hey, I collected some data over the last year about our referrals for special education, and 90% of them have to do with reading decoding. in
Yes.
these grade levels, I think maybe we need to address this within general education so not everything is becomes a special education issue.
Totally.
Well, how did you and your team try to make sure that MTSS was culturally responsive and equitable for all students?
Collect data on all your groups and look at that data about all the groups at your school. Make sure to have those conversations. It can be easy to not want to not want to talk about some of that because you might not be ready as a school team to face that, but be prepared to do that. So yes, my thought is to make sure you're collecting data on different groups, talk about that data, be prepared to have those discussions with the school community too. You know, we would have discussions about our different groups at school, whether it's students with disabilities, students of different cultures and races, students that speak different languages, right? All kinds of those areas. We had those discussions as our tier two team. And then we brought that data to our school community, all the parents, all the teachers. That information was shared. And it wasn't always comfortable, to be honest. You know, it's not fun to share that you're maybe not performing in a way that you want to, need to, desire to. And then we also had the discussions about how to remediate. What is there any training we want to do? Are there any books we want to read? Do we want to do a book club? How do we open our thinking to improving that when possible? And sometimes in our districts, there could be district-wide initiatives in terms of being culturally responsive as well. Maybe you're not in a district that has something like that. How can you start those conversations? And they're not easy ones. I keep saying that because it is. They're intimidating sometimes conversations to have, but the value they have is tremendous when you understand how impactful it is in your different student groups, right? If you see a
Yeah.
group that's not being served appropriately, what do we need to do to support that?
Well, looking ahead, what trends do you see influencing the future of MTSS and school psychology?
Fantastic question. Okay, so when I was active in my school groups, I always I use the word active and now I kind of want to because I was very active. I would say I was too active in my certain tiers. I am an involved person. I like to help. I like to be involved. The trend that I hope to see, that's how I'll answer. The trend I hope to see is that we can remember that our tier one supports are gen ed type supports. Perhaps your school psychologist doesn't have to have some of those conversations because they're embedded in the culture of the school system. Tier two, maybe the school psych is a little bit more involved, but again, those students typically are not in special education yet, our tier two students. And so the trend I'd love to see is that our school psychologist doesn't have to convince folks to learn about that tier and to advocate for that tier. Now that might take time, but I think the more we talk about these things with our school communities and really build upon the idea of what MTSS actually is, and people start to see the impacts, and I know I used the word believe in it earlier, but advocate for it with us, I think we're going to get there. It's going to become a part of school culture and community just naturally, as other
Mhm.
things are. As it's natural to watch students stand and walk in line across campus, it'll be natural to help support students where they're at in the different levels at MTSS. That's the trend I'm going to manifest for our field.
I love it. Well, are there any books, articles, or resources that you would recommend to school psychologists or educators interested in learning more about MTSS?
Yes. So when I was thinking about this question, there's two books that came to mind, and right, just for everyone, full transparency. When I logged on to the Zoom, I was like, Jenny, I got to grab these books so I can show people what the books are. So there's two that have been really helpful for me. One is called, and for those of you that can't see it, it's The Guide for White Women Who Teach Black Boys. And I thought this book because I wanted to have some of those conversations I had talked about being culturally responsive in the MTSS process. I often felt like our behavior supports were maybe not tailored to thinking about being culturally responsive. And so I wanted to learn about how to do that within the parameters of my experience as a white person. How could I respond appropriately. So this one was really helpful for me, and then using it to kind of guide conversations with others. So definitely this one. And then my second one, Jenny, I have you do you use slash love, maybe you don't love, but do you ever use the prim?
I love the prim. I love that it covers so many different areas. And I find it to be a resource that anyone can use picking it up. Like, you don't have to be a school
Yes.
psychologist to, like, I remember walking into my schools, it was a book that was on the shelf in the teacher's lounge. It
Yes.
wasn't reserved just for me.
Yes. And that's why I want to share it. This is called the Pre-Referral Intervention Manual, and I have the fourth edition. I know I bought this a couple years back, so I'm not sure if there's a fifth one yet, but I'll make sure to share the most up-to-date link with you, Jenny. And this one, as Jenny mentioned, there's resources for all kinds of things. You flip through this book and you can look at, I just opened it randomly, and the concern is does not perform or complete classroom assignments during class time. And then there are 116 ideas and ways to support that. So it's very organized. Look at the colors for those of you that love organization. But really, it's something that you could have on the table at these discussions with your school team to just think of an idea. And they might not be perfect, and you might not love all of them, but it gives you a jumping off point where you can then tailor that intervention to that particular student. So if you are starting conversations about MTSS with your school, get yourself a copy of the prim, or have your school buy one for the MTSS team if possible, because you're going to have a lot of ideas. The last thing you want, and I didn't choose books about MTSS, right? I chose books on purpose to be effective out there in the field. And I want to just be clear about that you can read about MTSS all you want and love it and learn about it. But out there doing it, we all know is so different than
Yeah.
reading about it in grad school. So how can you feel effective and be effective? The last thing you want to do is sit at a tier 2 meeting and not have an idea to share, and feel like you're not at least offering a teacher something. So that's why I share what I shared. And I'm excited for folks, to hear if others have maybe better ideas or different ideas. I'd love to learn about them. These are just kind of two of my go-tos to feeling effective within this system.
And we will make sure to put a link to both of those books in the show notes. So if you do not have those yet on your shelf, that you are able to get those. Well, to finish up our wonderful conversation here, going back into my past, when I was in newer school psych, I always had a difficult time falling asleep on Sunday nights, as I always had a pre-referral SST, whatever you guys call those meetings, Monday morning, first thing at one of my schools. And I was always concerned someone would ask me a question I didn't know the answer to, or I wouldn't know how to decide if testing was a good next step. There was always those moments in those meetings where everyone stopped talking and they just stared at me. So,
Yep.
Amy, what suggestions would you give to that version of me? How did you walk into your schools feeling as prepared as possible for those important meetings?
Two things come to mind. One is be honest with everyone. And not that you're not honest, but I'm being transparent about where you are in that moment. If you're unsure, it's okay to say that, in that meeting and say, this is a tough conversation to figure out what to do next. Like, that is very appropriate to say. You don't have to have all of the answers. Now, you don't want that to be the end of the conversation, right? You want to use that to guide the rest of the discussion, but it's okay to be honest. Be honest about the process. Be honest about what it means to assess. Be honest about the concerns you might have. Well, I'm thinking about assessing for this reason, but I'm concerned about this thing. Talk about your thought process so folks can understand and learn, and honestly kind of help you figure out which route to go. Number 2 is communicate. Communicate with your team members ahead of time if you can, afterwards, during, talk to the parent, talk to your SLP, your RSP teacher. I always have this fear in my mind that I would choose testing and then everybody would be like, "Oh, Amy, we're doing another one. We're testing another kid." So I didn't like that. I don't want my team to feel blindsided. So make sure teams have information. Hey, everybody, I'm going into an SST. I'm thinking it might go this way. Not sure. Just want to let you know. Have that open communication. Have those folks at the table too, if you can.
Mhm.
Have an RSP teacher there, an SLP there, asking questions to be helpful. Communicate and understand that you have a role to play, and that's what you're doing. It's not your role to do everyone's role. And I love that I'm saying that because I'm a do everyone's role person, but trying to remember that, right? I'm doing my job the best. I'm being honest, I'm being transparent, and I'm communicating and communicating for the child, right? That's what we're there to be doing. I think that that's not going to fix, pre-Jenny's Sunday scaries. It's not going to make them go away. But I do hope it would have instilled some confidence in you to know that I'm there. And honestly, I'm doing the best I can, for lack of a better phrase, right? That's all we can do. And we should be proud of that.
Yeah. Well, and that would have been really nice advice way back when, because I thought I was supposed to know everything and
Yeah.
I thought every decision was mine. And
Exactly.
so, I learned with my different teams to communicate. I realized that it wasn't just my decision, but it
Yep.
took me a while to do that. And I probably would have really appreciated. So if
And
you
give
could
yourself that
travel
grace.
back in time and fix that
Perfect.
for me. Yeah.
On it, on it. And also, if you are in that position that pre-Jenny was in, give yourself that grace to have time to learn too. Because, the first year, the second year, a year at a new school, maybe you're 20 years in, but it's a new school, a new team. It's going to take that time to figure out, and that is okay. So just hear that and know that we believe in you over here.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on the podcast again, Amy. And thank you for sharing all of your knowledge about this really important topic. Thank you. Thank you.
Of course. So excited to be here. Thank you.
And for all of our listeners, thank you for listening to the Prepared School Psych podcast. Through collaboration and knowledge exchange, we can cultivate a brighter and more successful future for all students. Until next time, keep fostering positive learning environments. That concludes another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast. And I hope today's discussion equipped you not just with knowledge, but also the confidence to take action. Remember, every conversation we have and every resource we share builds a bridge towards a more inclusive and empowering learning landscape for our students. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more insightful conversations and resources to support your journey. Share this podcast with colleagues. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder, everyone, the information and advice provided in this podcast are for guidance purposes only, and all listeners are required to follow both federal and state law and their own school district guidelines and policies. Thank you.